Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and don't miss any of our stories. Your lips meet mine with the force of a long-damaged storm. I can't breathe. I can't think. His hands grip my face with a firmness that reveals both control and desperation. We are at the top of his empire of glass and steel, 50 floors above the city he dominates, and yet, at this moment, I am the one who seems to have power over the great Ethan Blackwood. "Oliver," he whispers against my mouth, his hot breath mingling with the expensive taste of the whiskey we were drinking moments before. My fingers tangle in his black hair, softer than I've ever imagined in all the times I've fantasized about this moment. His body presses me against the glass wall, and down below, the lights of New York flash as if applauding our moment of surrender. I feel the heat emanating from him, the texture of his Italian suit under my palms when I finally find the courage to touch him. The intensity of the kiss diminishes, but not the tension between us. When he pulls away, his blue eyes, normally as cold as the steel that built his empire, are darkened by something I can't fully identify. Desire? Regret? Calculation? "You have no idea what you've just started," he says, his deep voice making my whole body vibrate. And really, I had no idea. I had no idea that that kiss would be just the first chapter in the most dangerous story I've ever been involved in. My name is Oliver Hayes, and until 3 months ago, I was just another journalism student trying to survive in New York with a part-time job in a coffee shop and dreaming of cover stories that would change the world. Now, I still don't know exactly what I am. Perhaps a voluntary prisoner, maybe an explorer of dangerous territories, or maybe just a passionate fool who has lost control of his own narrative. It all started with an article for the university newspaper. New Titans, the young billionaires transforming the American economy. It was supposed to be just another story, just another item for my portfolio. My investigative journalism teacher, the dreaded Ms. Winters, had challenged us to get interviews with unreachable figures. Most of my classmates targeted local politicians or second-tier celebrities. I, driven by an ambition that often puts me in impossible situations, chose Ethan Blackwood. At just 32, Blackwood was the CEO of Obsidian Financial Group, a company that had revolutionized the investment market with artificial intelligence algorithms. Reserved, he rarely gave interviews and was known for his cold and calculating temperament in negotiations. The tabloids nicknamed him the Lone Wolf of Wall Street, not only because of his ferocity in business, but also because he was never seen with the same escort twice. "You're dreaming too big, Oliver," said my flatmate, Marcus, when I shared my plan. "People like you and me don't get into the world of people like him." But I've always been stubborn. I spent 2 weeks emailing every possible contact at Obsidian Financial. I called secretaries, press officers, and even tried to approach employees outside the company's imposing building in downtown Manhattan. Nothing worked. Then, in what I can only describe as fate or cosmic irony, I met Samantha Blackwood, Ethan's younger sister, at a lecture on digital journalism at the university. She was a guest speaker, the director of a digital media startup that I didn't even know had a connection to the Blackwood family. "You're persistent, Mr. Hayes," she said when I approached her after the event, surprising me by knowing my name. "My brother mentioned that there's a rather insistent journalism student trying to interview you." My face burned with embarrassment. "Did he mention me?" Samantha laughed, a surprisingly warm sound coming from someone with the surname Blackwood. "Don't worry, he wasn't angry. In fact, I think he was intrigued. He said you were the only one who didn't try to use flattery or intimidation." She took a business card from her handbag and wrote something on the back. "This is his assistant's personal email address. Tell him I sent it. I can't promise anything, but—" She smiled. "Ethan appreciates determination, and sometimes he likes to be surprised." 3 days later, a 15-minute interview was scheduled in the penthouse that served as Ethan Blackwood's personal office. The Obsidian Tower was a monument to ambition and power, 50 floors of black glass that reflected the Manhattan sky like a dark mirror. The lobby was all white marble and brushed steel, creating a contrast that was almost painful on the eyes. "Mr. Hayes to see Mr. Blackwood," I informed the receptionist, trying to sound more confident than I felt in my only decent suit, bought at a liquidation 3 years earlier. She looked at me with an expression that clearly said, "You don't belong here," but checked my name in her system and nodded. "50th floor, penthouse office." The private elevator to the penthouse required a special card, which was provided by a security guard with an impassive expression. As I ascended, alone in that mirrored box, I mentally rehearsed my questions once again. I needed to maximize every second of those 15 minutes. The doors opened directly onto a large space that looked more like a modern art gallery than an office. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of New York that made my stomach leap, both for its beauty and its dizzying height. "Mr. Hayes." The voice took me by surprise. I turned around, and there he was, Ethan Blackwood himself, standing next to an abstract sculpture that probably cost more than all my possessions put together. Pictures didn't do him justice. He was taller than I'd imagined, with broad shoulders perfectly outlined by his tailored black suit. His black hair was precisely combed, and his pale skin contrasted with intense blue eyes that seemed to read my most secret thoughts. "Mr. Blackwood," I managed to say, holding out my hand. "Thank you for seeing me." His handshake was firm, his fingers long and cold against my palm. 15 minutes as agreed. My sister speaks highly of you. I hardly know her, actually. A tiny smile curved his lips. Samantha has good judgment of character. She's rarely wrong about people. He gestured for me to follow him to an area with 2 white leather sofas. "Coffee?" "Yes, please." He didn't call for an assistant. Instead, he walked over to a small counter and prepared 2 cups of espresso in a machine that looked like it came out of an Italian design laboratory. "So," he said as he handed me a thin porcelain cup, "do you want to know how I built my financial empire? How I revolutionized the market with predictive algorithms? The secrets of my success?" There was a slight tone of boredom in his voice. I took a sip of my coffee, the best I'd ever tasted, and put my recorder on the coffee table. "Actually, I'm more interested in the man behind the empire. Everyone knows what you've built, Mr. Blackwood. Few know who you are." His eyes narrowed slightly, and for a moment I thought I had made a fatal mistake. Then something unexpected happened. He laughed. A short, low laugh, but genuine. "Interesting," he murmured. "Well done, Mr. Hayes. You have my attention." The 15 minutes turned into 30, then an hour. Ethan Blackwood was an enigma, alternating between deeply personal answers about his difficult childhood with an absent father and a mother struggling with addiction, and calculated deflections when we touched on subjects he didn't want to discuss. "Last topic," he said, glancing at his wristwatch that probably cost more than my university tuition. "Choose wisely." I hesitated, then decided to take a chance. Why would someone who values control and privacy so much agree to give me this interview? His eyes met mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. Maybe I was curious about the young man so determined to meet me. He leaned forward slightly. "About what you would see when you looked at me. Most people only see what they want to see. Power, money, influence. You seem to be looking for something different." I turned off the recorder, feeling that this part of the conversation was no longer for publication. "I'm looking for the truth. That's what journalists do." "The truth," he repeated as if savoring the word. "A fascinating and dangerous concept, Oliver. May I call you Oliver?" I nodded, suddenly aware of how he occupied the space, how the air seemed electrified between us. "The truth is that you intrigue me," he continued, "and people who intrigue me are rare." He took a card from inside his jacket and held it out to me. It was black, with just a phone number printed in silver. "This is my personal contact, if you have any more questions for your article, or anything else." Our fingers touched briefly as I took the card, and I swear I felt an electric current run through my skin. I was about to say thank you when his phone rang. "I need to take this," he said, his tone returning to professional cool. "Calvin will escort you out." And so, as abruptly as it had begun, our meeting ended. As the security guard led me back to the elevator, I felt the weight of the black card in my jacket pocket. There was something dangerously seductive about the idea of having a direct channel to Ethan Blackwood, a man who certainly didn't offer that privilege to many. What I didn't know then was that that card wasn't just a form of contact. It was an invitation to a world I didn't understand, a world of power and obsession that I wasn't prepared to be a part of. The article was a success. Ms. Winters praised it as surprisingly intimate, and suggested that I submit it to larger publications. My colleagues wanted to know how I had managed to get Ethan Blackwood to talk about his difficult childhood and his early insecurities in business, topics he had never addressed publicly. For 3 days, I carried the black card with me, occasionally pulling it out of my pocket to check that it was real. For 3 nights, I typed the number into my cell phone, only to delete it before pressing call. On the 4th night, in my small shared apartment, with Marcus away at one of his many parties, I sent a message. Mr. Blackwood, this is Oliver Hayes. I wanted to thank you again for the interview. My article received an excellent review. The reply came almost instantly. Congratulations, Oliver. And it's Ethan, please. Would you like to celebrate your success? I'm sending you a car. Be ready in 30 minutes. I stared at the cell phone screen, my heart racing. This was crazy. I should turn it down. I had work to do, a morning shift at the coffee shop the next day, but I found myself typing, "I'll be ready." Exactly half an hour later, a message said the car was waiting. It wasn't just a car. It was a black limousine with a uniformed driver who opened the door as if I were important. The vehicle took me to what looked like a private club in Soho. No external signage, just a discreet door guarded by a man in a suit who nodded when I mentioned Ethan's name. The interior was a study in restrained opulence, low lighting, dark leather furniture, contemporary art on the walls. Only a few tables were occupied by people who seemed too important to look around. Ethan was sitting alone in a booth at the back, a glass of something amber in his hand. He was wearing a black shirt unbuttoned at the collar, no tie, but he still looked more dapper than I did in my best clothes. "Oliver," he said, standing up to greet me. "Welcome to Oblivion." "Is that your club?" I asked, as he gestured for me to sit down. "It's one of my secondary investments," he replied with a slight smile. "I like places where I can control the atmosphere." A waiter silently materialized next to us. "Same for my guest," said Ethan. "What are we drinking?" "Japanese whiskey aged 18 years, a small distillery I bought last year." The waiter brought my drink, and Ethan raised his glass in a toast. "To journalistic talent and the curiosity that brings the right people together." I took a sip, feeling the liquid burn pleasantly in my throat. "Why am I here, Ethan?" His eyes sparkled with appreciation for my frankness. Straight to the point. I like that. He swirled the liquid in his glass before continuing. "You had the courage to ask me things that no one else does. The insight to see beyond the facade I've carefully constructed. That's refreshing. That's my job as a journalist." "No, your job would be to report facts. You did more. You sought understanding." He leaned a little closer. "Do you know how many people actually try to understand me, Oliver? Not the CEO, not the billionaire, but the man? I imagine very few." "None," he corrected. "Even you." There was something hypnotic in his voice, in the way his eyes never left mine. I felt my face heat up, and it wasn't just from the whiskey. "I have a proposal for you," he continued. "I'm looking for someone to write my unauthorized biography." I nearly choked on my drink. "An unauthorized biography that you authorize?" He smiled, a real smile that transformed his usually serious face. "Exactly. I want someone to document my life, my business, my complexities, but with complete editorial freedom, without interference from me. Why me? I'm just a student. Because you see things that others don't. And because," he paused, his eyes roaming over my face in a way that made me aware of every inch of my skin. "I believe we can have a productive chemistry." At that moment, I understood the double meaning of his words. The air between us seemed charged with electricity. "It would be an incredible opportunity professionally," I continued, trying to keep the conversation on safe ground. "But I have to ask what the deal would be. Simple. Full access to my life for 6 months. Interviews, documents, travel with me when necessary. In return, a generous advance and, of course, the exclusivity that will make your career take off before you even graduate." It sounds too good to be true. His gaze intensified. "There are conditions, of course. Absolute discretion during the process. A confidentiality agreement, and," he paused, "your complete honesty with me, always." Something in the way he said it made me feel that he was negotiating much more than a book contract. "I need to think about it," I finally replied. "Naturally." He took another card out of his pocket, this time a white one with the address of his personal apartment. "Tomorrow evening, 8 o'clock. Dinner at my residence to discuss the details. If you come, I'll consider you interested." The rest of the evening passed in a haze of intellectual conversation and expensive drinks. Ethan was fascinating, cultured, intelligent, with strong opinions on everything from politics to contemporary art. When we finally left the club, it was almost midnight. "My driver will take you home," he said as we waited at the curb. The limousine glided silently towards us. "Thanks for the evening," I said, holding out my hand for a shake. Instead of shaking my hand, Ethan held it for a moment longer than necessary, his thumb tracing a gentle circle in my palm. "See you tomorrow, Oliver," he said, with a certainty that suggested he knew my decision even before I did. As the limousine took me back to my normal world, I realized that I was being drawn into the orbit of a man who was clearly used to getting exactly what he wanted. The question was, what exactly did Ethan Blackwood want from me? If you're enjoying this story and want to know how the relationship between Oliver and Ethan develops, be sure to like and comment below. Your comments and support are essential for me to continue bringing you stories that capture intense emotions and complex relationships. What will Oliver's decision be? What does Ethan really want from him? I spent the entire next day in a state of nervous agitation. Ethan's proposal sounded like an extraordinary professional opportunity, the kind that journalism students only dream of getting after years in the business. But there was something else, a subtext that I couldn't ignore. "Are you really going to Ethan Blackwood's private house for dinner?" Marcus asked, incredulous, as I tried to decide what to wear. "The same guy who has his own article in Forbes 30 Under 30 and who buys companies like he buys coffee?" "It's just a business dinner," I replied, even though I didn't fully believe it myself. "Business, of course," Marcus smiled, raising his eyebrows suggestively. "Just be careful, man. People like him are used to getting what they want." At 7:45, I was standing in front of Ethan's building on the Upper East Side, a restored Art Deco building that looked like it had been transported from another era. The doorman already knew my name and led me straight to the private elevator that went up to the penthouse. The apartment door opened before I even knocked. It wasn't Ethan, but a middle-aged woman in a discreet uniform. "Mr. Hayes," she greeted with a slight European accent. "I'm Elena, Mr. Blackwood's housekeeper. Please come in. He's waiting for you in the dining room." The apartment was exactly what I would have expected from the man. Elegant, minimalist, with design pieces that probably cost more than a car. The walls displayed contemporary art that I recognized from major galleries, and the view of Central Park was breathtaking even at night. Ethan was standing by an exquisitely set table, wearing dark pants and an immaculate white shirt with the sleeves carefully folded up to his forearms. He seemed more approachable this way, less CEO and more human. "Oliver," he smiled, coming up to shake my hand. "Punctual. I appreciate that." His touch lingered a second longer than necessary, and I noticed how his eyes quickly traveled down my body, assessing my attempt to look professional in my best blazer and slacks. "Your apartment is amazing," I commented, trying to hide my nervousness. "It's just a place where I sleep," he replied with a shrug. "I prefer to think of it as a private gallery." He gestured towards the table. "Shall we have dinner? The chef has prepared something special tonight." Dinner was served by a personal chef who appeared only to present each elaborate dish before disappearing back into the kitchen. The food was extraordinary, sophisticated without being pretentious, accompanied by perfectly paired wines. We talked about literature, politics, my journalistic ambitions. Ethan was a fascinating interlocutor, moving easily between topics with a sharp wit that left me constantly on my toes. "So," he finally said as we sipped coffee after dessert, "have you thought about my proposal?" "I have," I replied, gathering my courage, "and I have a few conditions, too." An eyebrow rose, surprise or perhaps amusement on his face. "Conditions? That's interesting. Go on. Complete editorial control, as you mentioned. Access to your files and contacts, and—" I hesitated before adding, "clarity about your expectations. All of them." Ethan slowly placed his coffee cup on the table, his eyes never leaving mine. "You're more perceptive than you appear, Oliver." "I have to be. It's my job to read between the lines." He stood up abruptly. "Let's continue this conversation somewhere more comfortable." I followed him into a living room with leather sofas and a modern fireplace burning, creating dancing shadows on the walls. He went to a bar in the corner and poured 2 shots of cognac into crystal glasses. "I'll be straightforward," he said, handing me one of the glasses. "I'm interested in you, Oliver. Not just professionally, My heart raced, but I kept my face neutral. I get it, and you still came tonight. Because of the professional opportunity. Just for that? He moved closer, his expensive perfume enveloping my senses. Didn't you feel the connection between us during the interview? Last night at the club? I took a sip of cognac to buy time, feeling the liquid burn my throat. I felt something, I finally admitted, but I don't mix business with other things. Me neither, normally. He sat down next to me on the sofa, close enough for me to feel the warmth of his body. But there are exceptions to every rule, aren't there? And what exactly are you proposing? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Ethan swirled the cognac in his glass, watching the firelight reflect off the amber liquid. A partnership, professional and personal. You'll have your book, your big break. I'll have someone who sees beyond the facade I've built. That sounds like a very unequal deal in terms of power. He smiled, that rare, genuine smile that transformed his face. Clever. Most people wouldn't even realize that. I'm not most people. Clearly not. He placed his glass on the table and, in one fluid movement, took my hand. His touch was warm and surprisingly gentle. I can be very intense, Oliver. I control everything in my life, my business, my environment, my relationships. It's my nature. And you want to control me too? I asked, my voice coming out lower than I intended. His fingers traced gentle circles on the palm of my hand, sending goosebumps down my arm. I want to know you. I want you to know me, really know me. The rest, we'll see. He was dangerously close now, his blue eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that made my breathing fail. I should get up. I should keep things professional. I should remember all the reasons why this was such a bad idea. Instead, I heard myself say, I accept your proposal. For the book. Just for the book? His hand went up my arm, resting on the curve of my neck. For now, I managed to reply, my pulse racing under his touch. He nodded slowly, as if he had won a small victory. Fair enough. We'll start tomorrow. His fingers pulled away, leaving my skin tingling. And as for the rest, I believe that some things can't be rushed. The following weeks were a roller coaster of emotions and discovery. During the day, I immersed myself in Ethan Blackwood's world, accompanying him to meetings, interviewing his associates, reviewing documents that told the story of his financial empire. Ethan was different at work, cold, calculating, sometimes ruthless. I watched him destroy the arguments of executives making millions, make and unmake fortunes with a few words, navigate the world of the ultra-rich like a predator in its natural habitat. You don't seem to approve of my methods, he commented one afternoon, after a particularly tense meeting where he had fired a senior executive in front of the entire board. He had a family, 3 children, I replied, as we rode up in the private elevator. And he'll get a generous severance package, more than most people get in a decade. His eyes fixed on mine in the elevator mirror. Business is no place for sentimentality, Oliver. Is that how you see all your relationships? As transactions? Something darkened in his gaze. Not all of them. Our evenings were different. Dinners at exclusive restaurants where we were always seated at the best table. Private cultural events where Ethan vaguely introduced me as my biographer. Deep conversations in his apartment that often stretched late into the night. And there was the constant tension between us. The seemingly casual touches. The glances that lasted seconds too long. The electricity in the air when we were alone. Ethan never crossed the boundaries I had tacitly set, but his attraction to me was palpable. And to my surprise and confusion, I found myself increasingly attracted to him too. Why haven't you ever had a long-term relationship? I asked one evening, as we sat on the balcony of his penthouse, the city glittering below us. He was silent for so long that I thought he wouldn't answer. Control, he finally said. I like control. In my companies, in my finances, in my personal life. And relationships require giving up some of that control. Exactly. He looked at me intensely. Very few people are worth that sacrifice. I swallowed, feeling the weight of his words. It was during a trip to San Francisco for a technology conference that things changed between us. Ethan had insisted that I accompany him, booking a suite adjacent to his in the city's most exclusive hotel. After a long day of meetings and presentations, we were in his suite going over my notes when a sudden storm caused a power outage. The sudden darkness was broken only by the lights of the city through the panoramic windows. It must be temporary, said Ethan, his silhouette jagged against the window as he looked out over the partially darkened city. It looks like it hit the whole neighborhood, I commented, approaching the window. We stood side by side, watching the storm transform San Francisco into a dramatic tableau of lights and shadows. The silence between us was charged with something that had been growing for weeks. "Oliver," his voice was low, almost a whisper. "Are you trying to avoid me today?" "No," I answered automatically, then hesitated. "Maybe." "Why?" I turned to face him in the dim light, his expression partially visible in the diffused city light. "Because this is getting complicated. Us, this situation. I'm here to write your biography, not to—" "What for?" He moved closer, narrowing the space between us. "You know what for." One of his hands touched my face, so lightly it could have been my imagination. "Say it." My heart was beating so hard that I was sure he could hear it. "To get involved with you, and yet here we are." His fingers traced the line of my jaw. "Weeks of pretending there's nothing going on between us." "Ethan?" I began, not knowing how to finish. A flash of lightning lit up the sky, bathing the room in white light for an instant, revealing the intensity in his eyes. When the darkness returned, his lips met mine. It was unlike any kiss I had ever experienced. Controlled and yet passionate, as if Ethan was imposing his will on me and at the same time surrendering to something inevitable. My hands found his chest with the initial intention of pushing him away, but instead grabbed his shirt, pulling him closer. He moaned low against my mouth, a sound of satisfaction and desire that made my whole body vibrate. His hands gripped my face, then slid down to the back of my neck, my shoulders, my back, each touch leaving a trail of warmth. The storm outside seemed like a reflection of what was happening inside me. Thunder, lightning, the destruction of carefully constructed barriers. When we finally separated, we were both breathing hard. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed as if savoring the moment. "That complicates everything," I murmured. "It clarifies everything," he corrected, his fingers entwined in my hair. "We can't keep pretending, Oliver." The lights suddenly came back on, bringing us back to reality with their unforgiving clarity. I took a step back, suddenly aware of the line we had just crossed. "I need to think," I said, my voice betraying my confusion. "This affects the book, the work." "Stay," he said simply, holding out his hand to me. "I can't," I replied, even though every cell in my body wanted me to. "Not now. I need space." Something flashed across his face, frustration, perhaps disappointment. But then he nodded, that characteristic control taking over again. "As you wish. We'll talk tomorrow." I went back to my suite, my mind a whirlwind of contradictory emotions. The kiss had changed everything and nothing at the same time. It was what I had feared and secretly longed for since our first meeting. The next morning, when we met for breakfast, Ethan was impeccably dressed and composed, as if nothing had happened. Only his eyes, more intense than ever when they rested on me, revealed the change between us. "We need to establish some rules," he said, as we waited to be served in a private restaurant overlooking the bay. "Rules? If we're going to explore this aspect of our relationship, I need you to understand a few things about me." His voice was calm, professional, as if we were discussing the terms of a contract. "I'm not the kind of man who does conventional relationships, Oliver." "What exactly does that mean?" He took a sip of coffee before answering. "It means that I need control, in every respect, and especially with someone who means something to me." A shiver ran down my spine. "I mean something to you?" For the first time since I'd met him, Ethan seemed momentarily vulnerable. More than it should, considering how long we've known each other. And this control, what does it imply? "Exclusivity, absolute honesty, and your trust in my decisions." I frowned. "That sounds rather one-sided." A smile curved his lips. "In return, I offer protection, safety, experiences you never imagined, and the promise never to cross boundaries that you clearly set." "Boundaries," I repeated, trying to process what he was proposing. "Everyone has limits, Oliver. The difference is that I'm asking you to know yours, while I explore everything that's inside them." My pulse quickened at his words, at the implications behind them. "What about the book? My work? They're separate from this. We'll continue as we were professionally." He hesitated, his gaze roaming over my face. "Unless you'd prefer to end the project." "No," I replied quickly. "The book is important to me." "Then we need a clear line between work and the rest." I looked out of the window at the Golden Gate Bridge, partially covered by the morning mist. I was entering unknown territory, drawn to the gravity of a man whose world was as different from mine as possible. "I need to think about it, Ethan." He nodded, that unshakable calm returning. "Naturally, I don't expect an immediate answer, just honesty when you decide." We returned to New York the same day, but I was different. The kiss had broken something inside me, a barrier between the Oliver I knew and a version of myself I was only just beginning to discover. I spent the weekend in my small apartment, ignoring Marcus's messages, asking about my work with the billionaire, trying to put my thoughts in order. On Monday, I received a message from Ethan. "We need to talk. Dinner at my apartment tonight, 8 o'clock. Just talk, I promise." I replied with a simple confirmation, even though I knew I was heading for something that could change my life completely. When I arrived at her apartment, Elena led me out onto the terrace, where Ethan was sitting by an elegantly set table, the city glittering around us. "Thank you for coming," he said, getting up to greet me. There was a formality in his demeanor that hadn't been there before. "Your invitation seemed important," I replied, sitting down in the chair he had indicated. We dined in polite, distant conversation, discussing politics, the latest books we'd read, nothing personal. It was only when coffee was served that Ethan finally addressed the real reason for our meeting. "I've thought a lot about our situation, Oliver." He placed his cup on the table with precision. "And I've come to a conclusion." "What?" "We must completely separate the personal from the professional, for your protection and mine." I felt a pang of disappointment that I hadn't expected. "So you want to end whatever is going on between us?" "No." His eyes met mine with renewed intensity. "I want to formalize it. A clear agreement with defined expectations on both sides." "An agreement," I repeated, incredulous. "Like a contract?" "Exactly like a contract." He stood up, walking over to a side table where an elegant leather briefcase rested. "I have everything documented here. You drew up a contract for us?" "That's what I do, Oliver. I structure relationships, set parameters, mitigate risks." He placed the folder in front of me. I opened it with slightly trembling fingers to find a document several pages long, impeccably formatted and detailed. "Personal Relationship Agreement." I read the title out loud in disbelief. "Read it carefully," said Ethan, returning to his seat. "I want you to understand exactly what you're getting into." I spent the next 20 minutes reading the most surreal document of my life. It detailed expectations of exclusivity, confidentiality, public conduct. There were entire sections dedicated to personal preferences, boundaries, and even a glossary of terms. I hesitated, looking for the right word. "Intense." "I'm an intense man," he replied simply. "I don't do anything by halves, Oliver, especially when it's something or someone I want. What if I don't accept? Then we'll just continue with the book. Professional, distant, and no repetition of what happened in San Francisco." His tone was neutral, but I saw a glimmer of something in his eyes. Fear, perhaps? "It's your choice." I closed the folder slowly, my mind filled with conflicting thoughts. Why me? There are hundreds of people who would give anything to be with you. And that's precisely the reason. He leaned forward, his mask of control momentarily lowered. "They want Ethan Blackwood, the billionaire, their idea of me. You see through it. You question, you challenge. You're not easily impressed. So you want me because I don't prostrate myself at your feet?" A smile curved his lips. "I want you for many reasons, Oliver. Your intelligence, your integrity, your beauty." His eyes traveled over my face with undisguised appreciation. "But mainly because when I'm with you, I feel something I rarely experience." "What?" "Genuine curiosity, a desire to reveal parts of myself that I keep carefully hidden." He paused. "And an equally strong desire to discover every part of you." The air between us seemed charged with electricity. His admission, surprisingly vulnerable coming from such a controlled man, completely disarmed me. "I need time to think," I finally said, standing up. "That's more than I expected." He nodded, that mask of control back in place. "Take the contract, make notes, suggestions. It's a negotiation, not an ultimatum." At the door to his apartment, he held my arm gently, his fingers leaving a trail of warmth on my skin. "Oliver," his voice was lower, more intimate. "Regardless of your decision about us, the book goes on. Your career won't be affected." "Thank you," I replied, surprised by his consideration. I leaned in for a quick kiss goodbye, an impulsive gesture I hadn't planned. His lips met mine with a restrained warmth, as if he were deliberately holding back. When I pulled away, his eyes were dark, his breathing slightly altered. "Good night, Oliver," he said softly. "Good night, Ethan." I went out into the New York night with the contract in my hands and the certainty that I was on the brink of something that would change my life forever. For better or worse, I still couldn't tell. 3 days passed without me getting in touch with Ethan. I continued working on the book, organizing my notes and transcripts, but I deliberately avoided making a decision about the contract. On the 4th day, I received a bouquet of flowers at my apartment. Rare orchids in an elegant arrangement with a simple card. No pressure. Just a reminder that I'm thinking of you, E. The gesture, surprisingly romantic coming from someone as pragmatic as Ethan, touched me in a way I hadn't expected. That evening, I reread the contract, this time more calmly. There were clauses that bothered me, expectations that seemed excessive, but I also found in it a brutal honesty that was, in its own way, refreshing. Ethan wasn't trying to trick me. He was laying his cards on the table, revealing exactly who he was and what he wanted. The next day, I sent him a message. "Can we meet to discuss the contract? I have some conditions of my own." His reply was immediate. "My apartment, 7 o'clock. I'll be waiting." When I arrived, Ethan was sitting in his office working on a laptop. He immediately closed it when he saw me, as if I were more important than any billionaire's business. "You came," he said, a slight smile on his lips. "With a few amendments," I replied, taking the contract out of my bag. I had marked several sections with detailed notes. "Show me," he said, indicating a chair next to him. We spent the next hour in a surprisingly balanced negotiation. Ethan listened to my concerns with genuine attention, giving in on points I considered important, explaining his reasoning when he disagreed. "This relationship should work for both of us," he said, surprising me. "I don't want you to feel diminished or controlled beyond what's comfortable for you. That's what confuses me about you," I admitted. "One moment, you seem to want to control every aspect of my life. The next, you show a consideration that contradicts that image." He reflected for a moment. "I was brought up in a chaotic environment, Oliver. My father was abusive. My mother was often absent, dealing with her own demons. I learned early on that control was the only way to survive. And now? Now is how I breathe." His eyes met mine. "But I'm willing to adapt my expectations of you, within the limits of what I can bear." That confession, that little revelation of vulnerability, was what finally decided me. "I accept," I said softly. With the changes we discussed, something shone in his eyes. Triumph, relief, desire, all mixed together in an intensity that made my heart race. "I'll revise it and bring you a final version tomorrow," he said, his voice controlled, although I could see the tension in his posture. "Or," I suggested, moving closer to him, "we could advance some aspects of the deal." His breathing faltered visibly. "What aspects?" In response, I leaned in and kissed him, my hands holding his face. For a moment, he seemed frozen in surprise. Then, with a low sound that seemed to come from deep in his throat, he pulled me closer, deepening the kiss with an intensity that left me breathless. His hands slid down my back, gripping my waist tightly as he guided me back against his desk. There was an urgency in his touch, as if he had held back for too long. "Oliver," he murmured against my lips, my name a curtsy and a plea. "I'm here," I replied, allowing myself to be guided by his experience, his intensity. He pulled away slightly, his eyes roaming over my face as if he wanted to memorize every detail. "Are you sure?" The question, so considered in the midst of obvious desire, touched me deeply. "I am. For now, just that. Just us." With one fluid movement, he lifted me up, sitting me on the edge of his desk, positioning himself between my legs. His kisses traced a path down my neck, while his deft hands slowly, reverently unbuttoned my shirt. "You're perfect," he murmured, his lips brushing against my newly exposed skin. "From the first moment I saw you, I knew I had to have you." My hands found his hair, his shoulders, delighting in the firmness of his body under the expensive fabric of his shirt. There was something intoxicating about taking him apart like this, seeing the powerful Ethan Blackwood surrender to desire, his defenses lowered for my sake. When his hands reached for my belt, I hesitated instinctively. He stopped immediately, his eyes searching mine. "Too fast?" I nodded, embarrassed. "A little. Can we go slowly? Instead of frustration, I saw appreciation in his gaze. Of course, we have all the time in the world. He kissed me again, more gently this time, his hands coming up to rest on my cheek with a tenderness that contrasted with his usual intensity. In that moment, I glimpsed a side of Ethan Blackwood that few would ever see. Patient, caring, almost vulnerable. We spent the rest of the evening exploring the limits of each other's comfort. Kisses that ranged from sweet to desperate. Touches that revealed as much as they concealed. Whispered conversations that paved the way for something deeper than mere physical attraction. When I finally left his apartment in the early hours of the morning, I felt both exhausted and more alive than I had ever been. I had chosen to enter Ethan Blackwood's world. Now I just had to find out if I could keep my own identity intact in the process. Oliver and Ethan's story is just beginning to heat up. If you're curious to find out how this intense relationship will develop and what secrets will still be revealed, be sure to follow the final part. Will Oliver be able to cope with Ethan's controlling side? What limits will be tested? And most importantly, can love flourish in a relationship built on control and power? Keep following to find out! The agreement was signed the following morning in an almost solemn ritual in Ethan's office. The final version incorporated my main requests: privacy protected, boundaries respected, and a clause allowing me to end the relationship at any time without prejudice to the book project. That's an unusual contract, I commented, looking at our two signatures side by side on the official paper. We're unusual people, Ethan replied, storing the document in a safe built into the wall. His eyes met mine with an intensity that was now familiar. And what we have is unique. The following weeks were a delicate dance between the professional and the personal. During the day, I was the biographer, interviewing people from his past, examining documents, writing chapters that captured Ethan Blackwood's meteoric rise. At night, I explored completely different territory, the side of Ethan that very few people knew. I discovered that, for all his need to control, he could be surprisingly considerate. He quickly learned my preferences, the books I liked, the music that calmed me, how I had my coffee on the mornings I woke up in his apartment. But there were also times when his domineering nature was on full display. He planned our dates down to the last detail, chose what I should wear to important events, and expressed disapproval when I made decisions without consulting him. "You're being controlling," I remarked one evening after he had rearranged my schedule to include a dinner with an important editor who could boost my future career. "I'm being efficient," he corrected, sitting behind his desk, impeccable in his suit even after a long day. "There's a subtle but important difference. And what would that be? Control is about power. Efficiency is about results." His eyes met mine. "I want the best for you, Oliver. For us." It was hard to argue when his interventions often resulted in tangible benefits. The editor we had dinner with offered me a contract to publish monthly articles after the biography was finished. My advisor at university was impressed by my unprecedented access to one of the most powerful men in New York. But as I got closer to Ethan, I noticed cracks in his carefully constructed facade, occasional nightmares that woke him up sweating in the middle of the night, a severe intolerance to certain music that evoked memories of his childhood, an almost imperceptible nervousness when his father was mentioned. "You never talk about your father," I commented one Sunday morning as we sipped coffee on the balcony of his penthouse, the city waking up below us. His expression immediately tightened. "There's not much to say. He's been mentioned in several interviews I've done. People say you were similar. People don't know anything." The coldness in his voice was cutting. "My father was a narcissistic tyrant who measured his worth by the fear he inspired in others. And that affected you." He looked at me longingly, as if deciding how much to reveal. "It shaped me. There's a difference. Tell me," I asked softly, placing my hand over his. Over the next hour, Ethan revealed details of his childhood that were not in any public record. A violently perfectionist father who punished failure with calculated cruelty, an emotionally absent mother who sought refuge in substances, a determination forged in suffering never to be vulnerable. "When I was 12, I promised myself that I would never again be at anyone's mercy," he concluded, his voice restrained but charged with suppressed emotion. "That I would build my own world where I would make the rules. And that's what you've built," I observed. "An empire where you control everything, including people." he added, his eyes meeting mine with brutal honesty. That's why I prefer relationships with clear parameters. No surprises, no unpredictable variables. Like feelings. A sad smile curved his lips. Especially feelings. They're the most dangerous variable of all. Is that why you never say you love me? The question slipped out before I could stop it, revealing a vulnerability I hadn't intended to show. Ethan stayed very still, his eyes studying my face with an almost painful intensity. And that's important to you? Maybe, I admitted, feeling suddenly exposed. Sometimes I wonder what I really am to you. He stood up, walking to the balustrade of the balcony, his imposing figure cut out against the Manhattan sky. When he turned, there was something different in his gaze, something that looked almost like fear. You're the variable I can't control, Oliver. The equation I can't solve. He took a deep breath. And yes, that absolutely terrifies me. The book progressed rapidly. Within 4 months, I had a substantial manuscript that captured not only Ethan's professional trajectory, but also nuances of his complex personality, his ruthless determination, his strategic intelligence, his rigid principles of loyalty. There were parts of his life, however, that remained obscure. Certain gaps in his story that neither official records nor interviews could completely fill, particularly the years between his 23rd and 26th birthdays, when he had disappeared from the public radar, only to re-emerge with the revolutionary algorithm that would become the basis of his empire. I need to know about the missing years, I mentioned one evening, as we worked side by side in his office, me on the manuscript, him on some international business. His fingers stopped on the keyboard. Is it necessary? It's fundamental, I insisted. It's where it all began for you, the origin of Obsidian. Some secrets need to remain secrets, Oliver, he said, his tone leaving no room for discussion. Not in a biography, I argued, especially one that you yourself authorized. He closed his laptop with a soft but decisive click. There's a reason I kept that period of my life private. I'm not ready to share it, not even with you. In the months of our relationship, I had learned when to push and when to back off. But this time, something in me refused to budge. How can I write your true story if you hide parts of it? How can I really know you? His expression hardened. You know me better than anyone alive, Oliver. Isn't that enough? Not if I'm writing your biography. I stood up, frustrated. And maybe it's not enough for us either. Something flashed in his eyes. Anger, maybe hurt. What does that mean? It means that we've built something based on honesty, but you still have walls around you. Walls that you won't allow me to break through. He stood up too, the tension palpable between us. There are things about me that you wouldn't understand. Decisions I've had to make that would alter how you see me. You don't trust me enough to let me decide that, I replied, hurt. I trust you, he insisted, his voice lowering. But I don't trust anyone's reaction to the darkest parts of me. Not even yours. I left the office that night without resolution, the first real disagreement between us leaving a bitter taste. Over the next few days, we kept a polite distance, still working together, still sharing moments of intimacy, but with something unresolved hanging between us. It was Samantha, Ethan's sister, who inadvertently brought the subject up again. During an interview for the book, she casually mentioned, "Of course, after what happened with Robert Thorne, Ethan was never the same." Robert Thorne? I asked, the name unfamiliar to me from all my research. Samantha paled visibly. He didn't tell you about Robert? No. Who was he? She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. It's not my story to tell, Oliver. You should ask my brother. When I confronted Ethan that night, he was furious, not at me, but at his sister for mentioning the taboo name. Robert Thorne was my mentor, he finally said, pouring himself a generous shot of whiskey. And then my worst enemy. The story that followed revealed the darkest chapter of Ethan's life. Robert Thorne, a brilliant Wall Street investor, had recognized Ethan's potential fresh out of college and taken him under his wing. For 3 years, Ethan worked directly with Thorne, learning financial market secrets, building connections, developing the algorithm that would eventually revolutionize everything. He was like a father to me, Ethan admitted, his voice charged with an emotion he rarely showed. The first adult who really believed in me. What happened? Ethan swallowed the rest of his drink before continuing. He tried to steal my work. The algorithm was my creation, but since I worked for him, I could legally claim it. When I discovered his plans, he hesitated, his eyes fixed on some distant point. I took steps to protect what was mine. What kind of measures? The kind that ensured Robert Thorne never worked on Wall Street again. His gaze met mine, cold and calculating. I discovered that he had manipulated certain markets years before. I provided evidence to the authorities anonymously. You destroyed his career. He tried to destroy my future, Ethan retorted, no remorse in his voice. It was poetic justice. So what? He lost everything. Fortune, reputation, family. There was a clinical distance in how Ethan recounted the destruction of a man. 6 months later, he was found dead in his apartment. Suicide. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. He killed himself because of what you did. He killed himself because of what he did, Ethan corrected, a harshness in his voice that I rarely heard. I just exposed the truth. I looked at him as if I saw him in a new light. Not the controlled, calculating Ethan I knew, but someone capable of a revenge that had driven a man to ultimate despair. Now you know, he said, watching my reaction. The secret I didn't want you to find out. The way I was really born into the business world, on the ashes of someone who tried to betray me. I remained silent, processing what I had just heard, feeling the weight of the confession between us. You judge me for that, he said, not as a question. I'm trying to understand, I replied honestly. The man I know who shows me so much consideration is also capable of destroying someone without remorse. I'm both of those men, Oliver. His voice was soft now, almost resigned. The man you've gotten to know over these months and the man who will do whatever it takes to protect what's his. I've always been honest about that. I stood up, needing space to think. I need some time to decide if you still want to be with me, now that you know this part of me. There was no accusation in his voice. Just a sad acceptance. To decide if I can reconcile these two versions of you, I corrected, and to understand what that means for us. I spent the next 3 days in my own apartment, ignoring Ethan's messages, trying to find clarity. The book manuscript, almost complete, stared back at me from my laptop screen, the story of a man I thought I knew, but who continued to surprise me. On the 4th day, Samantha showed up at my door, unannounced. My brother's a mess, she said without preamble. I've never seen him like this from anyone. Did he send you here? He'd kill me if he knew I was here, she replied with a sad smile. But I thought you should know something about Robert's history. She came in, sitting down heavily on my battered sofa, as out of place in her designer ensemble as I felt in Ethan's luxurious world. Ethan didn't tell you everything, she continued. Robert Thorne wasn't just your mentor, it was his first serious relationship. The revelation took me by surprise. They were together? Samantha nodded. For almost 2 years. Robert was older, powerful, charismatic, and Ethan, well, you know Ethan. He never does anything by halves. He didn't mention that. Of course not, she sighed. Robert's betrayal wasn't just professional, Oliver. It was deeply personal. He used Ethan's love against him, manipulated him emotionally while planning to steal his job. Suddenly, Ethan's ruthless reaction took on a new dimension. It wasn't just about business, but about a devastating personal betrayal. Why didn't he tell me? Because Ethan Blackwood, with all his power and control, is terrified of being vulnerable. She looked straight at me. Until you came along, he built a world where he could keep everyone and everything at a safe distance. And with me? With you, he's risking everything again. She stood up to leave. Only you can decide if he deserves this chance. After Samantha left, I picked up my phone and sent Ethan a simple message. Can we talk? Your apartment, tonight. When I arrived, I found him standing by the panoramic window, watching the city. He turned when he heard me come in, and I was shocked by his appearance. Deep circles under his eyes, an unshaven beard, a vulnerability in his eyes that I'd never seen before. You came, he said simply. Your sister visited me. A shadow of irritation crossed his face. Samantha has always been overly protective. She told me about you and Robert. Ethan remained very still, his expression carefully neutral. I see. Why didn't she tell me? Because it's the most shameful part of my life, he admitted, his voice low. I let myself be manipulated by someone who claimed to love me. I was blind, naive, weak. Being betrayed isn't weakness, Ethan. For me, it is. He moved closer, stopping a few steps away. I learned the most painful lesson possible about trusting someone, about loving someone. And that's why you need so much control now, he concluded, the pieces finally falling into place. That's why the contracts, the rules, the parameters, He nodded slowly. I built a system where no one could ever hurt me like that again. Even me, he said softly. Am I right? His eyes met mine, that rare vulnerability still present. You're the only person who's managed to get past my defenses since then, and that completely terrifies me. I took a step towards him, then another, until we were only centimeters apart. Ethan Blackwood, afraid of a simple journalism student? A faint smile curved his lips. There's nothing simple about you, Oliver Hayes. I touched his face gently, feeling the rough beard under my fingers. I still don't know if I can reconcile all the versions of you. The ruthless man who destroyed your ex-lover, the control freak who needs to dictate every aspect of our lives, and the vulnerable man in front of me now. They're all parts of me, he replied honestly. I can't change who I am, Oliver. I'm not asking you to. Our gazes locked on each other. I'm just asking you to trust me enough to show me all those parts, even the ones you think will make me run away. Something broke in his expression, one last defense giving way. He pulled me into a desperate embrace, his face buried in my neck. I'm afraid of losing you, he whispered, words I'd never imagined hearing from Ethan Blackwood. After everything we've shared, Ethan, I replied softly, my arms wrapping around him tightly. I never demanded perfection from you, only honesty. When we parted, I saw something in his eyes that I'd never seen before. Not just desire or fascination, but something deeper, more frightening in its intensity. I love you, Oliver Hayes, he said, the words coming out almost against his will. Completely, irrationally, against all my better judgment. The statement caught me off guard, not just by his words, but by the absolute vulnerability with which they were delivered. Ethan Blackwood, the man who controlled financial empires, was handing over his heart with no guarantees, no contracts, no protection. I love you too, I replied, the truth of the statement surprising me as much as it did him. With all its complexities and contradictions, he kissed me then, a kiss unlike any before, not calculated, not controlled, but exposed and true. That night, there were no more walls between us, no secrets unrevealed, no part of us hidden from the other. 3 months later, the manuscript was complete. Not just the story of Ethan Blackwood's financial empire, but the complex journey of a man shaped by trauma and betrayal who found his way to vulnerability again. I included Robert Thorne's story, with Ethan's permission, not as a scandal, but as a formative moment that explained so much of who he had become. Are you sure about this? I asked as he read the final chapter. Once it's published, there's no going back. I'm tired of secrets, he replied, closing the manuscript. And this is the real story, not the sanitized version my PR team would create. Something had changed in Ethan since our confrontation, a subtle lightness, as if a weight he had carried for years had been partially lifted. He was still controlling, still organized our time together with almost military precision, still demanded excellence from everyone around him. But there were also moments of spontaneity, of surrender, of trust that would have been unimaginable when we first met. The contract between us still technically existed, but it was rarely mentioned. A relic of a time when trust needed to be formalized in order to exist. On the day the manuscript was sent to the publisher, Ethan surprised me with an unforeseen trip, a weekend in an isolated cabin in the mountains, with no internet, no phones, no outside world intruding on our private universe. No agenda, he promised as he drove his sports car down the winding road. No expectations. The cabin was luxurious in its rusticity. Wood and natural stone, overlooking a crystal-clear lake surrounded by majestic trees. No staff, no chef, just the two of us. Can you cook? I asked, surprised, as he began to prepare our dinner with evident skill. There are many things about me that you don't know yet, he replied with an enigmatic smile. We have a lifetime to find out. The words hung between us, laden with promise. A lifetime. It was the first time either of us had mentioned a long-term future so explicitly. Later, sitting on the balcony under a starry sky we would never see in Manhattan, Ethan held my hand, his fingers intertwined in mine with a familiarity that now seemed natural. You know what I like most about you, Oliver? He asked, his voice soft in the darkness. My impeccable journalistic skills? I joked. Your courage, he corrected seriously. You had the courage to confront me when no one else would, to demand truth when it would be easier to accept the polished version, to love someone like me with all my faults. It's not courage, I replied honestly. It's just love. True love doesn't allow masks. He turned to me, his face illuminated by the moonlight, more open and vulnerable than I had ever seen it. You changed my life, he said simply. I thought I was inviting you to write my story, but in fact you rewrote my future. At that moment, under the stars, far from the empire he had built, Ethan Blackwood was not the feared Wall Street tycoon or the meticulous controller. He was just a man who had found the courage to love again, despite all the scars of the past. And I, the journalism student who had entered his world out of professional ambition, had found something that no contract could capture, no book could fully describe: the transformation that occurs when two people choose to let down their defenses, one for the other, one day at a time. Ethan Blackwood's biography was published a year after our first meeting, quickly becoming a bestseller. Critics praised its brutal honesty, the complex narrative of a man whose failures were as significant as his triumphs. "You've captured the essence," said Samantha after reading the book. "No one has ever understood my brother as completely as you do." What readers didn't know, what no interview revealed, was how the story continued after the last page. How I moved into Ethan's apartment 6 months after publication. How he slowly learned to let go of the reins of control, trusting that not everything needed to be planned in order to work. How I learned to navigate the privileged world he inhabited without losing my identity or principles. It wasn't always easy. There were heated discussions about his instinct to micromanage my nascent career as a writer. Moments when his deep-rooted insecurities resurfaced, causing him to build walls that we needed to tear down again. Occasions when my own need for independence clashed with his desire for protection. But there were also unexpected joys. The look on Ethan's face when I showed him the manuscript of my first novel. The pride in his eyes when I refused his help in getting a publishing contract, determined to win on my own merits. The vulnerability in his voice when he finally took me to see his mother's grave, sharing memories he had never confided in anyone. And there was the moment, on our second anniversary, when he took me to the terrace of his building, the same place where we had first kissed, and handed me a small velvet box. "No contract this time," he said, opening the box to reveal a pair of elegant, simple wedding rings. "Just a promise, to try, every day, to be worthy of the man who taught me to love without fear." As I placed the ring on my finger, I thought of the naive young man who had walked into that same building 2 years earlier, looking only for an interview that would boost his career. How could he have imagined that he would find not just a story to tell, but a story to live? Ethan Blackwood still controlled financial empires with an iron fist. He still intimidated executives in boardrooms, still made difficult decisions without hesitation. But in the private space we built together, he had found something just as powerful: the freedom that comes when you finally allow yourself to be truly known, truly vulnerable, truly loved. And I, Oliver Hayes, the journalist who had set out to uncover the truth about one of the most powerful men in New York, had discovered a much deeper truth in the process: that even relationships that begin with contracts and conditions can, with time and trust, transform into something that no document could ever capture. Something that, against all odds, we could simply call love. Thank you for following Oliver and Ethan's journey through this intense and transformative novel. If you were moved by the evolution of these characters, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support is what inspires me to continue creating stories about complex relationships and the transformative power of true love. If you enjoyed 50 Shades of Sin, be sure to check out my other works and follow the upcoming releases that promise to thrill and captivate as much as this story.